Okay, so next section for me starts on page 222. It's literally the section previously, right after the end of that. That fall, two guys showed up in Welch who were different from anyone I'd ever met. They were filmmakers from New York City, and they'd been sent to Welch as part of a government program to bring cultural uplift to rural Appalachia. Their names were Ken Fink and Bob Gross. At first, I thought they were joking. Ken Fink and Bob Gross. As far as I was concerned, they might as well have said their names were Ken Stupid and Bob Ugly. But Ken and Bob weren't joking. They didn't think their names were funny at all, and they didn't smile when I asked if they were putting me on. Ken and Bob both talked so fast, their conversation filled with references to people I'd never heard of, like Stanley Kubrick or Woody Allen, that it sometimes was hard to follow them. And although they had no sense of humor about their names, Ken and Bob did like to joke a lot. It wasn't the sort of Welch high humor that I was used to, Pollock jokes and guys cupping their hands over their armpits to make fart noises. Ken and Bob had this smart, competitive way of joking where one would make a wisecrack and the other would have a comeback, and the first would have to retort to the comeback. They could keep it up until my head spun. One weekend, Ken and Bob showed a Swedish film in in the school auditorium. It was shot in black and white and had subtitles and a plot heavy on symbolism. So fewer than a dozen people came, even though it was free. Afterward, Lori showed Ken and Bob some of her illustrations. They told her she had a talent, and if she was serious about becoming an artist, she needed to go to New York City. It was a place of energy and creativity and intellectual stimulation, the likes of which we'd never seen. It was filled with people who, because they were such unique individuals, didn't fit in anywhere else. That night, Lori and I lay in our rope beds and discussed New York City. The things I had heard always made it sound like a big, noisy place with lots of pollution and mobs of people in suits elbowing one another on the sidewalks. But Lori began to see New York as a sort of emerald city, this glowing, bustling place at the end of a long road where she could become the person she was meant to be. What Lori liked most about Ken and Bob's description was that the city attracted people who were different. Lori was about as different as it was possible to be in Welch. While most of the other kids wore jeans, Converse sneakers, and t-shirts, she showed up at school in army boots, a white dress with red polka dots, and a jean jacket with dark poetry she'd painted on the back. The other kids threw bars of soap at her, pushed one another into her path, and wrote graffiti about her on the bathroom walls. In return, she cursed them out in Latin. At home, she read and painted late into the night, by candlelight or kerosene lamp if the electricity was turned off. She liked Gothic details, mist hanging over a silent lake, gnarled roots heaving up from the earth, a solitary crow in the branches of a bare tree on the shoreline. I thought Lori was amazing, and I had no doubt she would become a successful artist, but only if she could get to New York. I decided I wanted to go there too, and that winter we came up with a plan. Lori would leave by herself for New York in June after she graduated. She'd settle in, find a place for us, and I'd follow her as soon as I could. I told Lori about my escape fund, the $75 I'd saved. From now on, I said, it would be our joint fund. We'd take on extra work after school and put everything we earned into the piggy bank. Lori could take it to New York and use it to get established so that by the time I arrived, everything would be set. Lori had always made very good posters for football rallies, for the plays the drama club put on, and for candidates running for student council. Now she started doing commissioned posters for $1.50 apiece. She was too shy to solicit orders, so I did it for her. Lots of kids at Welch High wanted a customized poster to hang in their bedroom wall. One of their boyfriend's or girlfriend's name, or their car, or their astrological sign, or a favorite band. Lori designed the names in big, fat, overlapping, three-dimensional letters like the kind on rock albums. Then she painted them day-glow colors, outlined in India ink so the letters popped, and surrounded them with stars and dots and squiggly lines that made the letters seem like they were moving. The posters were so good that word of mouth spread, and soon Lori had such a backlog of orders that she was working until 1 or 2 every morning. I made money babysitting and doing other kids' homework. I did book reports, science essays, and math. I charged $1 per assignment and guaranteed at least an A- or the customer was entitled to a full refund. After school, I babysat for $1 an hour and could usually do the homework then. I also tutored kids for $2 an hour. We told Brian about the escape fund, and he pitched in, even though we hadn't included him in our plans because he was only in the 7th grade. He mowed lawns or chopped wood or cut hillside weeds with the scythe. He worked after school until the sun went down all day Saturday and Sunday and came home with his arms and face scratched from the brush he'd cleared. Without looking for thanks or praise, he quietly added his earnings to the pig, which we named Oz. We kept Oz on the old sewing machine in the bedroom. Oz had no plugged hole on the bottom, and the slot on the top was too narrow to work bills out, even if you wanted a knife. So you'd put the money into Oz, and it stayed there. We tested it to make sure. We couldn't count the money, but because Oz was translucent, we could see our cash accumulating inside when we held him up at night. One day that winter, when I came home from school, a gold Cadillac Coupe de Ville was parked in front of the house. I wondered if the welfare agency had found some millionaires to be our foster parents and they had arrived to take us away, but Dad was inside the house twirling a set of keys on his finger. He explained that the Cadillac was now the official Walls family vehicle. Mom was carrying on about how it was one thing to live in a three-room shack with no electricity since there was a certain dignity in poverty, but to live in a three-room shack and own a gold Cadillac meant you were bona fide poor white trash. How'd you get it? I asked Dad. One hell of a good poker hand, he said, and an even better bluff. We'd owned a couple of cars since we'd been in Welch, but they were true buckets of bolts, with shuddering engines and cracked windshields. As we drove along, we could see the blur of the asphalt through the rusted-out floor panels. Those cars never lasted more than a couple of months, and like the Oldsmobile we'd driven from Phoenix, we never named them, much less got them registered and inspected. The Coupe de Ville had an unexpired inspection sticker. It was such a beauty that Dad declared the time had come to revive the tradition of naming our cars. That there caddy, he said, strikes me as Elvis. It crossed my mind that Dad ought to sell Elvis and use the money to install an indoor toilet and buy us new clothes. The black leather shoes I'd bought for 50 cents at the Dollar General store were held together with safety pins, which I tried to blacken with magic markers so you wouldn't notice them. I'd also used magic markers to make colored blotches on my legs that I hoped would camouflage the holes in my pants. I figured that was less noticeable than if I sewed on patches. I had one blue pair and one green pair, so my legs, when I took my pants off, were covered with blue and green spots. But Dad loved Elvis too dearly to consider selling it, and the truth was I loved Elvis almost as much. Elvis was long and sleek as a racing yacht. It had air conditioning, gold shag upholstery, windows that went up and down with a push of a button, and a working turn signal so Dad didn't have to stick his arm out. Every time we drove through town in Elvis, I'd nod graciously and smile at the people on the sidewalk, feeling like an heiress. You've got true noblesse oblige, Mountain Goat, Dad would say. Mom grew to love Elvis, too. She hadn't gone back to teaching and instead spent her time painting, and on the weekends we began to drive to craft fairs throughout West Virginia. Shows where bearded men in overalls played dulcimers and women in granny dresses sold corncob back scratchers and coal sculptures of black bears and miners. We filled Elvis's trunk with Mom's paintings and tried to sell them at the fairs. Mom also drew pastel portraits on the spot for anyone willing to pay $18, and every now and then she got a commission. We all slept in Elvis on those trips because a lot of the times we made only enough money to pay for gas, or not even that. Still, it felt good to be on the move again. Our trips in Elvis reminded me how easily it was to pick up and move on when the urge struck. Once you'd resolved to go, there was nothing to it at all. As spring approached and the day of Lori's graduation grew closer, I lay awake at night, thinking about her life in New York City. In exactly 3 months, I said to her, you'll be living in New York. The following week, I said, in exactly 2 months, 2 months and 3 weeks, you'll be living in New York. Would you please shut up, she said. You're not nervous, are you? What do you think? Lori was terrified. She was not sure what she was supposed to do once she got to New York. That had always been the vaguest part of our escape plan. Back in the fall, I had no doubt that she would get a scholarship to one of the city's universities. She'd been a finalist for the National Merit Scholarship, but she'd had to hitchhike into Bluefield to take the test, and she got rattled when a trucker who picked her up put the moves on her. She arrived nearly an hour late and botched the test. Mom, who supported Lori's New York plans and kept saying she wished she were going to the big city herself, suggested Lori apply to Cooper Union Art School. Lori put together a portfolio of her drawings and paintings, but just before the submissions deadline, she spilled a pot of coffee on them, which made Mom wonder aloud if Lori had a fear of success. Then Lori heard about a scholarship sponsored by the Literacy Society for the student who created the best work of art inspired by one of the geniuses of the English language. She decided to make a clay bust of Shakespeare. She worked on it for a week, using a sharpened popsicle stick to shape the slightly bulging eyes and the goatee and the earring and the longish hair. When it was finished, it looked exactly like Shakespeare. That night, we were all sitting at the drafting table watching Lori put the final touches on Shakespeare's hair when Dad came home drunk. That does indeed resemble old Billy, Dad said. Only thing is, I've been telling you, he was a goddamn fake. For years, every time Mom brought out one of Shakespeare's plays, Dad would carry on about how they'd been written not by William Shakespeare of Avon, but by a bunch of people, including someone named Earl of Oxford, because no single person in the Elizabethan England could have had Shakespeare's 30,000 word vocabulary. All this bunk about little Billy Shakespeare, Dad would say. The greatest genius, despite his grammar school education, his small Latin and less Greek, was a lot of sentimental mythology. You're helping perpetuate this fraud, he told Laurie. Dad, it's just a bust, Laurie said. That's the problem, Dad said. He studied the sculpture, then suddenly reached out and smeared off Shakespeare's mouth with his thumb. What the hell are you doing? Laurie cried out. It's no longer just a bust. Now it has symbolic value. You can call it mute bard. I spent days on that, Laurie shouted, and you ruined it. I elevated it, Dad said. He told Laurie he would help her write a paper that would demonstrate that Shakespeare's plays had multiple authors like Rembrandt's paintings. By God, you'll set the literary world on edge, he said. I don't want to set the world on edge, Laurie screamed. I just want to win a stupid little scholarship. God damn it, you're in a horse race, but you're thinking like a sheep, Dad said. Sheep don't win horse races. Laurie didn't have the spirit to rework the bust. The next day, she smushed the clay into a big glob and left it on the drafting table. I told Laurie that if she hadn't been accepted into art school by the time she graduated, she should go to New York anyway. She could support herself with the money we'd saved up until she found a job, and then she could apply to school. That became our new plan. Everyone was mad at Dad, which gave him a case of the sulks. He said he didn't know why he even bothered to come home anymore, since he no longer got the slightest bit of appreciation for his ideas. He insisted he wasn't trying to keep Laurie from leaving for New York, but if she had the sense that God gave a goose, she would stay put. New York is a sorry-ass sinkhole, he said more than once, filled with rapists. She'd get mugged if she finds herself on the street, he warned, forced into prostitution and winding up like a drug addict, like all those runaway teenagers. I'm only telling you this because I love you, he said. I don't want you to see you hurt. One evening in May, when we'd been saving our money for almost 9 months, I came home with a couple of dollars I'd made babysitting and went into the bedroom to stash them in Oz. The pig was not on the old sewing machine. I began looking through all the junk in the bedroom and finally found Oz on the floor. Someone had slashed him apart with a knife and stolen all the money. I knew it was Dad, but at the same time I couldn't believe he'd stooped this low. Laurie obviously didn't know yet. She was in the living room humming away as she worked on a poster. My first impulse was to hide Oz. I had this wild thought if I could somehow replace the money before Laurie discovered it was missing. But I knew how ridiculous that was. 3 of us had spent the better part of a year accumulating the money. It would be impossible for me to place it the month before Laurie graduated. I went into the living room and stood beside her, trying to think of what to say. She was working on a poster that said, Tammy, in Day Glow colors. After a moment, she looked up. What? She said. Laurie could tell by my face that something was wrong. She stood up so abruptly she knocked over a bottle of India ink and ran into the bedroom. I braced myself, expecting to hear her scream, but there was only a silence and then a small, broken whimpering. Laurie stayed all night to confront Dad, but he didn't come home. She skipped the following day in case he returned, but Dad was AWOL for 3 days before we heard him climbing the rickety staircase to the porch. You bastard, she shouted. You stole our money. What the goddamn hell are you talking about, Dad asked, and watch your language. He leaned against the door with a lit cigarette. Laurie held up the slashed pig and threw it as hard as she could at Dad, but it was empty and nearly weightless. It struck his shoulder lightly, then bounced on the floor. He bent down carefully at the floor, and floor beneath him could shift at any moment, picked up our ravaged piggy bank, and turned it over in his hands. Someone sure as hell gutted old Oz, didn't they? He turned to me. Jeanette, do you know what happened? He was actually half grinning at me. After the whipping, Dad had jacked up the charm with me, and even though I was planning to leave, he could make me laugh when he tried, and he still considered me an ally. But now I wanted to knock him over the head. You took our money, I said. That's what happened. Well, don't that beat all, Dad said. He started going on about how a man comes home from slaying dragons, trying to keep his family safe, and all he wants in return for his toil and sacrifice is a little love and respect, but it seemed these days was just too damn much to ask for. He said he didn't take our New York money, but if Laurie was hell-bent on living in that cesspool, he'd finance our trip himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few wad dollar bills. We just stared at him, so he let the crumpled money fall to the floor. Suit yourself, he said. Why are you doing this to us, Dad? Why? His face tightened with anger. He staggered to the sofa bed and passed out. I'll never get out of here, Lori kept saying. I'll never get out of here. You will, I said, I swear it. I believed she would because I knew that if Lori never got out of Welch, neither would I. I went back to G.C. Murphy the next day and stared at the shelf of the piggy banks. They were all either plastic or porcelain or glass, easily broken. I studied a collection of metal boxes with locks and keys. The hinges were too flimsy. Dad could pry them apart. I bought a blue change purse. I wore it on a belt under my clothes at all times. When it got too full, I put the money in a sock that I hid in a hole in the wall behind my bunk. We started saving again, but Lori felt too defeated to paint much, and the money didn't come as quickly. A week before school was out, we only had $37.20 in the sock. Then one of the women I'd been babysitting for, a teacher named Mrs. Sanders, told me that she and her family were moving back to their hometown in Iowa and asked if I wanted to spend the summer with them there. If I came along and helped her look after her 2 toddlers, she said she'd pay me $200 at the end of the summer and buy me a bus ticket back to Welch. I thought about her offer. Take Lori instead of me, I said, and at the end of the summer, buy her a bus ticket to New York City. Mrs. Sanders agreed. Low-lying, pewter-colored clouds rested on the mountaintops around Welch on the morning of Lori's departure. They were there most mornings, and when I noticed them, they reminded me of how isolated and forgotten the town was. A sad, lost place adrift in the clouds. The clouds usually burned away by mid-morning, and when the sun climbed above the steep hills. But some days, like the one Lori left, they clung to the mountain in a fine mist formed in the valley and turned your hair and face damp. When the Sanders family pulled up in their station wagon, Lori was ready. She had packed her clothes, her favorite books, and her art supplies in a single cardboard box. She hugged all of us except Dad. She had refused to speak a word to him since he plundered Oz, promised to write, and climbed into the station wagon. We all stood watching as the car disappeared down Little Hobart Street. Lori never once looked back. I took that as a good sign. When I climbed the staircase to the house, Dad was standing on the porch, smoking a cigarette. This family is falling apart, he said. It sure is, I told him. That fall, when I was going into the 10th grade, Miss Bivens made me news editor of the Maroon Wave. After working as a proofreader in the 7th grade, I'd started laying out pages in the 8th grade, and in the 9th grade, I began reporting and writing articles and taking photographs. Mom had bought a Minolta camera to take pictures of her pictures, so she could send them to Lori, who could show them around art galleries in New York. When Mom wasn't using it, I wore the Minolta everywhere because you never knew when you'd see something newsworthy. What I liked most about calling myself a reporter was that it gave me an excuse to show up any place. Since I'd never made a lot of friends in Welch, I hardly ever went to the school's football games or dances or rallies. I felt awkward sitting by myself when everyone else was with friends. But when I was working for the Wave, I had a reason to be there. I was on assignment, a member of the working press, with my notepad in hand and the Minolta around my neck. I began going to just about every extracurricular event at the school, and the kids who shunned me before now accepted me and even sought me out, posing and clowning in hopes of getting their pictures in the paper. As someone who could make them famous among their peers, I was no longer a person to be trifled with. Even though the Wave came out only once a month, I worked on it every day. Instead of hiding in the bathroom during lunch hour, I spent it in Miss Bivens' classroom, where I wrote articles, edited the stories written by other students, and counted the letters and headlines to make sure they fit the columns. I finally had a good excuse for why I never ate lunch. I'm on deadline, I'd say. I also stayed after school to develop my photographs in the dark room, and that had a hidden benefit. I could sneak into the cafeteria once everyone had left and dig through the garbage pails. I'd find industrial-sized cans of corn that were nearly full and huge containers of coleslaw and tapioca pudding. I no longer had to root through the bathroom trash baskets for food, and I hardly ever went hungry again. When I was a junior, Miss Bivens made me the editor-in-chief, though the job was supposed to go to a senior. Only a handful of students wanted to work for the Wave, and I ended up writing so many of the articles that I abolished bylines. It looked a little ridiculous having my name appear 4 times on the front page. The paper cost 15 cents, and I sold it myself from class to class, and standing in the hallways, hawking it like a newsboy. Welch High had about 1,200 students, but we only sold a couple hundred copies of the paper. I tried various schemes to boost the circulation. I held poetry competitions, added a fashion column, and wrote controversial editorials, including one questioning the validity of standardized tests, which provoked an irate letter from the head of the State Department of Education. Nothing worked. One day, a student I was trying to get to buy the wave told me he had no use for it because the same names appeared in the paper again and again. The school's athletes and cheerleaders, and a handful of kids known on the slide rules who always had the academic prizes. So I started a column called Birthday Corner, listing the names of the 80 or so people who had their birthday in the coming month. Most of these people had never appeared in the paper, and they were so excited to see their names in print they bought several copies. Circulation doubled. Miss Bivens wondered aloud if Birthday Corner represented serious journalism. I told her I didn't care. It sold papers. Chuck Yeager visited Welch High School that year. I'd been hearing about Chuck Yeager all my life from Dad, about how he'd been born in West Virginia in the town of Mira on the Mud River over Lincoln County, about how he joined the Air Force during World War II and had shot down 11 German planes by the time he was 22, about how he became a test pilot for Edwards Air Force Base held up in the Mojave Desert in California, and about how one day in 1947 he became the first man to break the sound barrier in his X-1, even though the night before he'd been up drinking and had been thrown from a horse and cracked some ribs. Dad would never admit to having heroes, but the brass-balled, liquor-loving, coolly calculating Chuck Yeager was the one man in the world he admired above all others. When he heard that Chuck Yeager was giving a speech at Welch High, and he had agreed to let me interview him afterward, Dad could hardly contain his excitement. He was waiting on the porch for me with pen and paper when I got home from school that day before the big interview. He sat down to help me draw up a list of intelligent questions so I wouldn't embarrass myself in front of this greatest of West Virginia's native sons. What was going through your head when you first broke Mach 1? What was going through your head when A. Scott Crossfield broke Mach 2? What's your favorite aircraft? What are your thoughts on the feasibility of flying at the speed of light? Dad wrote up about 25 or 30 questions like that, and then insisted we rehearse the interview. He pretended to be Chuck Yeager and gave me detailed answers to the questions he's written out. His eyes got misty as he described what it was like to break the sound barrier. Then he decided I need some solid grounding on aviation history, and he stayed up half the night briefing me by the light of the kerosene lamp on the test flight program, basic aerodynamics, and the Austrian physicist Ernst Mach. The next day, Mr. Jack, the principal, introduced Chuck Yeager during the assembly in the auditorium. He looked more like a cowboy than a West Virginian, but with his horseman's gait and his lean, leathery face. But as soon as he started speaking, his voice was pure up hollow. As he talked, the fidgety students settled into their folding chairs and became enraptured by the legendary, world-traveled man who told us how proud he was of his West Virginia roots, and how we too should be proud of those roots we all shared, and how regardless of where we come from, each and every one of us could and should follow our dreams, just as he had followed his. When he finished talking, the applause about shattered the glass in all of the windows. I climbed up on the stage before the students filed out. Mr. Yeager, I said, holding my hand, I'm Jeanette Walls from the Maroon Wave. Chuck Yeager took my hand and grinned. Just spell my name right, ma'am, he said, so my kins will know what you're writing about. We sat down on some folding chairs and talked for nearly an hour. Mr. Yeager took every question seriously and acted like he had all the time in the world for me. When I mentioned various aircraft he'd flown, the aircraft Dad had briefed me about, he grinned again and said, heck, I do believe we got an aviation expert on our hands. In the hallways afterward, the other kids kept coming up to me and saying how lucky I was. What was he really like, they asked. What did he say? Everyone treated me with deference accorded only to the school's top athletes. Even the varsity quarterback caught my eye and nodded. I was the girl who'd actually talked to Chuck Yeager. Dad was so eager to hear how the interview went that he was not only home when I got back from school, he was sober. He insisted on helping me with the article to ensure technical accuracy. I already had a lead figured out in my head. I sat down in front of Mom's Remington and typed out, the pages of the history books come alive this month when Chuck Yeager, the man who first broke the sound barrier, visited Welch High. Dad looked over my shoulder. Great, he said, but let's juice it up a little. Okay, so I'm going to stop there.